Hello guys, Art-Teeves here. In this video, I'll show you the basic workflow for modeling, UV unwrapping, texturing and baking the simple stylized plastic barrel prop. Let's get started. I decided to make the barrel lid a dome. This way I can nicely show you how to work with the top part of such objects. A regular sphere isn't really a good fit here. Its edges all converge into a pole, and that kind of topology starts looking really bad after a couple of turbo-smooth iterations. We won't be able to properly smooth the model unless we turn those poles into quads. If you're making a low-poly model, this effect may sometimes be ignored, but if the turbo-smooth modifier is involved, we have to use a different approach. So instead, I do it the simple way. I take a basic cube, throw turbo-smooth on it, you can use NURMS if you prefer, and I stop at 2 iterations. More than that, and the barrel would end up with way more than 16 sides. I don't want that. To make the shape feel more spherical, I apply the Spherify modifier. Then I just detach the top portion, and there's my ready-made dome base. As you can see, increasing the amount of turbo-smooth iterations requires us to reapply the Spherify modifier. However, with top and bottom poles now gone, we can easily increase the amount of iterations. Of course, everything we did so far works great, but turbo-smooth on a cube always gives us 8, 16, 32 sides and so on. So what do we do when we actually want, let's say, 18 sides? There are quite a few ways to achieve this, but this is the method I prefer and use most often. First, I create a cube and apply 2 iterations of turbo-smooth, same as before. Then I go to the middle edge loop and apply chamfer to it, splitting it into 2 edges. Next, because I want to slightly redistribute the edges around the sphere and make them sit more evenly, I select all the edges and use the Relax tool. You can find it in Loop Tools, Relax. I usually hit Relax a few times until the edge flow starts looking nicer and more balanced. After that, I apply the Spherify modifier again, and now we have a sphere with roughly the number of sides we were aiming for. Then I detach the top part of my sphere to turn it into a dome. I align the bottom edge loop to the corresponding axis so everything sits perfectly flat, and finally, I round regularize the bottom rim using the Loop Regularizer plugin. That's it, clean topology, controllable number of sides, and a nice even dome. Now I want to tweak the radius of this sphere to change the angles of my dome. I can't just squash it along the z-axis, that would totally mess up its curvature. In theory, I could throw on an FFD modifier and eyeball the bend until it looks right. But what if I want a truly honest, perfectly spherical result? The best and fastest way is to create a new sphere with the exact radius I need, and then conform our dome to it. Make sure to give that sphere as many polygons as possible, so it's really smooth. I head over to the Freeform tab, switch the peak mode from grid to surface, and select the surface I want to conform my dome to. Then I grab the conform brush and just click on my object using top projection. If nothing happens on this stage, you may want to check the settings of your conform brush. Conforming your dome may slightly deform it, so you may want to align its bottom edge to a corresponding axis, and maybe use the Loop Regularizer plugin or some alternative to space its sides evenly. You may even move some vertices manually while having the edge constraint function enabled. The object is symmetrical, so you only want to fix one of its quarters. I'm cutting out the holes for the future little caps using a cylinder and the ProBoolean tool. It's really important that your Boolean object has enough sides, otherwise the cutouts will look pretty ugly and faceted. I started with a cylinder that had 10 sides, but I added a chamfer to the 2 edge loops where the main bends happen. That gives us cleaner topology in those critical areas. To stretch the cylinder and taper it narrower on one end, I applied an FFD modifier. After that, I also manually moved one of the edges by hand to get the exact shape I wanted. Once I was happy with the shape, I applied ProBoolean. Right after the Boolean operation, I went in and manually welded some of the vertices together, watching the shading carefully and using target weld to clean things up. I didn't want the cutouts to be perfectly vertical, so I closed each one with the cap tool. Then I selected new flat surface, applied inset to it, and used collapse on the inner edge loops to simplify and clean up the center. We want a nice clean loop of near square polygons around each cutout. Since our main lid is symmetrical, I added a symmetry modifier to the whole thing. Symmetry automatically creates a new center edge loop that didn't exist before, and we usually want to remove that one. So after applying symmetry, I go in and delete that middle seam edge loop to keep the topology clean. I already mentioned the way I change the inner angle of my cutouts using the combination of inset modifier and collapse edges tools. Next, I apply a single chamfer to the external edges of my cutouts. Now I want to put some cylinders into those cutouts. Since I want to keep the ability to turbo smooth my model later on, I want those cylinders to have the exact same amount of sides as their surroundings. This way I can easily bridge them together with quads. First I align my cylinder to the middle of my lid, then move it into its place, and finally align its bottom vertices to the bottom of the cutout. I also position the cylinder the way that the polygons that bridge its sides to the lid do not overlap. It is possible to bridge the uneven number of sides together, and there are many techniques for that, but our small lids have 12 sides, which is nearly perfect. Less sides may make them too edgy, while more sides will increase our poly count for no reason. Finally, I create the top small lid and give its top and bottom parts a single chamfer. I cap it with the Rapid Tools plugin, using its Q-cap tool. This way a pole doesn't appear. If the bottom edges of those small lids are really close to the main barrel cap's surface, we may avoid chamfering them, sparing 24 polygons, since our chamfers will not be visible. When modeling the low poly barrel, I make sure that the external loop of my lid is made into a proper circle. To do this, I use the Loop Regularizer plugin. You can also use a tool provided by the Rapid Tools plugin or your favorite regularizer tool. Next I create a cylinder that has the same amount of sides as my lid, in our case 18. I give top and bottom parts of my cylinder a single chamfer, and model the lid's border manually, giving it some volume by using the shell modifier. I align my lid to the barrel, set its pivot point to the middle of its bottom part, and then scale the whole lid the way it fits inside the modeled borders of the barrel. Finally, I attach the lid to the barrel and bridge them together. I move the lid's borders while having the edge constraint function enabled. In order to align the lid's bottom part to the surrounding geometry, I enable vertex snapping. You can play with the barrel's curve a little bit by adding some supporting edge loops while holding the Shift key. This way 3ds Max will respect your existing edge flow. Here I spend some time scaling things and moving some vertices around. I also reassign some smoothing groups now and then, but it's definitely not the time to do it. Since I don't want the barrel's bottom to have a pull, I delete it and cap it with the Rapid Tools plugin. Some of the modern game engines handle angons well, but I prefer to stick to quads. For Rapid Tools Q-cap tool to work correctly, the object you are working on shall be converted into an editable poly. Also, the orifice you cap shall have an even amount of sides. In this section of the video, I'm going to show you a manual and honestly quite overkill method for creating a high poly barrel using a combination of turbo smooth and manually adding supporting edge loops. This approach loses out to crease sets in almost every real-world scenario, so if you'd rather jump straight to using crease sets, feel free to skip ahead to that part of the video. The timestamps and chapter list are in the description and pinned comment for easy navigation. For those sticking around, I'll walk you through the baking process with different settings, show you what results I got, and also demonstrate how to fix some common issues that pop up. First I realized I'd forgotten to add a single unit chamfers to the edges of the lid, so I went back and did that. Then I duplicated the barrel. I named the low poly version Barrel LP, and the high poly copy Barrel HP. These LP and HP suffixes are what Substance Painter uses to automatically match and transfer details from high to low poly when baking. While working on the high poly version, I added supporting edge loops to all the important borders. This prevents turbo smooth from rounding things off too aggressively and keeps the shapes staying firmly within their intended boundaries. I also added two plastic hoops around the middle of the barrel. I extruded them out, then applied chamfer to their border edges for a clean rounded look. Since this isn't a low poly model, we may ignore almost any restraints that normally limit our poly count. After that, I applied the Turbo Smooth modifier to the high poly model and cranked up a few iterations. Next I made sure the pivot points for both the low poly and high poly versions are perfectly centered at the bottom of each object, right in the middle of the base. Next I made sure the pivot points for both the low poly and high poly versions are perfectly centered at the bottom of each object, right in the middle of the base, and both are positioned exactly at scene coordinates 0, 0, 0. Finally, I slightly adjusted the borders of the low poly version so they fully encompass the high poly edges, just to make sure nothing gets clipped or baked incorrectly during the projection. I unwrapped the low poly model in RizomUV. The barrel is a super simple shape, so honestly you could unwrap it in pretty much any UV software you like. That said, I still wouldn't recommend doing it directly in 3ds Max, at least not without some specialized plugins. Our low poly version only has one single smoothing group, which means we got full control of where we place the main UV seams. If this wasn't the case, I'd have to put some seams over existing hard edges. I select edge loops with a double click and hit C to create the cuts. Overall, I separate the bottom, the barrel sides, the top hoop, the lid, and all the little details. Then I use U to unwrap, W to weld, O to optimize, and Ctrl plus page down to rotate the UV chunk by 90 degrees. I'm unfolding everything onto a 2K map with a pixel padding of 16. Ideally, especially if you're working on your own indie game, you'd combine multiple objects onto one texture atlas. Since the lid is hard-edged and separated from the rest of the barrel, I can scale it up along with all its related elements to make the most of the UV space I have. When packing the UV chunks, it makes sense to align them roughly the way they sit on the actual model. For example, I always try to keep horizontal elements running horizontally. It just feels more intuitive when texturing and looks cleaner in the end. Before exporting, I assign a single smoothing group to both models, the low poly and the high poly, and then apply the weight and normals modifier to each of them. Of course, there's no need to unwrap the high poly version at all. In Substance Painter, I make sure the models use exactly the same suffixes that I gave them back in 3ds Max, so LP and HP to get recognized automatically. I crank the ray count to the maximum on every baking tab, set my subsampling to 16, disable the ID map baking section completely, and double check that there are no purple lines or red artifacts anywhere on the model. And here's what we end up with. Honestly, I like the result. The details came through cleanly, the shading looks solid. That said, it can definitely be improved further, using Crease sets instead of manual supporting loops, and playing around with the cage, which I completely ignored in this video by the way. But for this particular workflow, this is what I got, and I'm happy with it. I crank up the roughness on my layers so the barrel doesn't come out too shiny. Overall, I start with an existing smart material and create 3 versions of it. One for the main barrel body, one for the small pipes, and one for their caps. From there, I build on top by adding various fill layers and grunges to bring in some wear and character. I pay special attention to the plastic edges, giving them those weathered, slightly worn borders. For that, I pull in grunge maps like Grunge Map 009, Grunge Sand Dry, Grunge Rust Fine, Grunge Map 31, and one more Rust Fine variation to layer in subtle dirt, scratches, and micro details. I also like to drop a ground dirt smut mask onto one of the layers. It creates a nice vertical gradient that grounds the model, making it look like it's been sitting around collecting dust from the bottom up. Whenever I add new materials or grunges, I try to set their projection method to triplanar wherever possible. This way I don't have to obsess over perfectly masking the UV seams, it just blends naturally across the model without obvious stretching or repeats. Most of the time I play around with grunge tiling and settings, especially their curvature settings. Since I add a stylization tool later on, the model will change dramatically, and we're just layering some kind of a base for it. You can also play around by reducing the height of some layers that add some scratched borders to your model. This will give it a much more intricate, battered look. I reduce the opacity of some base colors of various materials to make them less pronounced and let them blend properly with the rest of the model. I give my dust and dirt layers some high roughness value for them to stand out from the surrounding plastic and paint. As you can see, I still get some ugly UV seams that I'm going to fix a bit later. Also, I get some ugly baking data on my hoops that add details to the barrel. It happens because the topology of my high poly object was far from ideal. This is how I fix it. Basically, I change the edge flow to make those hoops smooth. After rebaking, I create a paint layer and set its blending options to pass through on all tabs. Then I use the clone stamp tool to fix my UVs manually. You can do it on various paint layers with different blending opacity, or simply alter the brush flow now and then to make everything looks nice and natural. I've cut out the part of the process where I meticulously paint all the seams of my model. Next I add another fill layer to highlight some edges and finally throw in a stylization tool. It is also a good idea to switch and turn your lighting and environment settings now and then to see how your model performs under different conditions. As you can see, I've changed some colors off camera, nothing significant happened there. At this point we can play with various stylization settings and also its presets. Unfortunately, my low poly barrel has way too many polygons right now. Kinda funny, isn't it? The thing is, I added a couple of extra segments and supporting edge loops that really help improve the baking results. If I go ahead and remove those segments, I can drop the poly count from roughly 700 down to about 400 polygons. I even remove some segments in the bottom part, since we won't be able to watch that curve up close in a game. However, if you are going to lift that barrel in the air, it's probably better to keep them. So I just remove those edges and enjoy a poly count cut almost in half. Sounds great on paper, but what else changes? Well, you can see it clearly in the screenshot I have here. From a distance the barrel still looks basically the same, no big drama. But up close, especially where some elements meet, you start getting those pretty ugly shading artifacts and faceting issues that just weren't there before. So is it worth it? For an indie project, personally I'd go with speed and lower poly count every time, over chasing absolute perfect polish. Some shading artifacts may also be avoided by simply splitting and exploding your model and baking its elements separately. Plus, there's actually a much more interesting and efficient method for creating high poly models in the first place, and I'll show you exactly that in the next section of the video. Here is a much better method for turning your low poly model into a high poly one. It revolves around some differences between TurboSmooth modifier and OpenSubdiv. The old way of modeling that I demonstrated in the previous sections forces you to add geometry everywhere to fight the smoothing, which results in heavy mesh, messy topology and tedious workflow. New way uses a single number per edge to define the smoothing, which gives you light mesh, clean topology, fast and easy control of every edge's behavior. The crease value tells OpenSubdiv exactly how much to fight the natural smoothing at that edge or vertex. Instead of adding geometry, support loops to hold shape, you assign a single number per edge to control how rounded or crisp that feature becomes in the final subdivided surface. This gives precise, adjustable control over every hard or soft transition without bloating the mesh. I'm not going to assign different parameters to individual edges. Instead, I'll apply a crease set to all the edges I want to keep somewhat sharp or controlled. I select those edges, go into the crease set modifier's edges section, create a new set from them, and assign it a crease value of 0.3. Nothing stops us from making multiple sets with different values. After my edges are selected, I turn the selection into a set and give it its control value. 0.3, just as I've mentioned earlier. After that, I apply the OpenSubdiv modifier on top and crank up the number of iterations. And here's what we get, literally in under a minute, with zero manual supporting loops or edge tweaking. Clean, controllable sharpness exactly where I want it, and the subdivision looks way more natural than what we get with TurboSmooth alone. One more thing, I give the lid and its smaller elements a separate smoothing group. And basically this is it. I think this covers everything I wanted to mention in this video. Thanks for watching, guys. If my videos are of use to you, please be my guest and subscribe to my channel for more stylized content. And most importantly, have a great day!